We are with our next video in period 8. This will be our next to last video in period 8. And this is dealing with topic 8.13 on the environment and natural resources from 1968 to 1980. And so what we're going to be looking at in this video is the way in which the United States' foreign policy, first of all, how the United States' foreign policy was shaped by concerns over access to oil. And then the next thing we'll be talking about in this video is how a modern environmental movement came about during the 1960s and 1970s, and so we'll be looking at that more specifically. So that brings us to our two big questions related to this topic. First of all, how did concerns over natural resources shape American foreign policy in the Middle East during the 1970s? And then the second big question, what were the causes and effects of a new environmental movement from 1968 to 1980? So first of all, with that first big question, we need to consider that as the United States was withdrawing from Vietnam in January of 1973 with the Paris Peace Accords, other foreign policy issues began to capture the attention of Americans and their government, specifically with issues in the Middle East. Ideological, military, and economic concerns would shape U.S. involvement in the Middle East throughout the 1970s, with several oil crises in the region eventually sparking attempts at creating a national energy policy. The most severe of these crises came in later in 1973, after the Paris Peace Accords had been signed, and the United States left Vietnam. Another war came about that grabbed the attention of the United States, though they didn't necessarily get involved in it, and this was the Yom Kippur War of 1973, when the nations of Egypt and Syria attacked Israel on October 6th. The resulting conflict would become known as the Yom Kippur War, the name taken from the attack being done on the holiest Jewish holiday, that being October 6th. And it presented the U.S. with the challenge of siding with a long-trusted ally in Israel or isolating other Middle Eastern countries in threatening Americans' ability to buy oil from those nations. Ultimately, President Nixon sided with Israel, angering the members of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. These OPEC members had the power to both limit the supply of oil being exported to the U.S. and raise the price of oil, and they chose to do both only 2 weeks after the initial attack in response to the U.S. support of Israel. Before long, the oil embargo enacted by OPEC altered the daily lives of Americans across the country. A national speed limit of 55 miles an hour was imposed by Congress in hopes of conserving gasoline, as drivers across the country had their belief in an unlimited supply of cheap fuel squashed by the oil crisis. In addition, the Congress also allowed for the construction of an oil pipeline to be constructed in the state of Alaska beginning in 1974. But nonetheless, for months, Americans drivers stood in long lines for gas, combating the embargo by carpooling, and they saw the price of gasoline almost double. Even though OPEC lifted the embargo in April of 1974, Americans continued to feel the effects of the crisis, as it almost single-handedly contributed to the post-World War II economic boom that the United States had been enjoying for almost 30 years. It saw the end of that economic boom almost single-handedly. The crisis also almost marked the beginning of a long period of runaway inflation that would plague the U.S. into the 1980s. Now, this brings us to our second big question related to a new environmental movement that's stemming from some of these issues of the oil crisis. As Americans were dealing with the oil crises stemming from conflicts in the Middle East, they were simultaneously growing concerned about the use of natural resources and its effects on the planet. Yet this did not happen in a vacuum. Environmental problems and accidents led to the growing environmental movement that aimed to use legislative and public efforts to combat pollution and protect natural resources. While the federal government established a new established new environmental programs and regulations. While this movement would not become nationally prominent until the 1970s, many historians mark the beginning of the modern environmental movement to be the publishing of biologist Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962, which claimed that pesticides had a more detrimental effect on wildlife than previously thought. Other events also contributed to this growing movement, including an oil rig explosion in the Santa Barbara Channel off the coast of California in January 1969, which ended up killing thousands of coastal and marine wildlife. Alarmed by these concerns, over 20 million Americans participated in the nation's first annual Earth Day on April 22nd, 1970, with around 70% of the public ranking the environment as the issue which needed to be addressed more than anything else. The federal government responded almost immediately. First, the Clean Air Act of 1970 restricted the emissions of cars in factories, while the Water Pollution Control Act provided funds to protect America's coastal waters and clean rivers and lakes around the country. The Endangered Species Act, as the name would suggest, protected endangered plants and animals from becoming extinct. In addition, President Nixon banned the use of the pesticide DDT and established the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, to enforce a wide range of environmental regulations in order to continue to protect the environment from things like overuse of too much output of emissions from our cars. Environmental concerns would continue beyond the 1970s, however, especially over the search for alternative forms of energy aside from things like oil. Hopes in one form of alternative energy were squashed temporarily with a nuclear power accident at 3 Mile Island, Pennsylvania in 1979, ensuring that Americans would continue to debate the use of energy consumption for years to come. All right, that's all we got for topic 8.13 on the environment and use of natural resources from 1968 to 1980. Be on the lookout for the next video on topic 8.14 on society in transition.